Fall of King Noel Baba. This is actually going to appear on my Patreon on Christmas Day. So I always try to do a holiday story. I actually do, because I write so many stories here on Patreon, not here on Patreon, here on Twitch. I do stories each month on Patreon. I do a whole month of stories every day in October and then another in December. And with everything I write here on Twitch, I have plenty to fill out those days. But this is going to be the holiday story that will appear December 25th on my Patreon page. I wrote it yesterday. It actually kind of had a couple broken sessions that it was kind of worked on, but I finished it up yesterday. This will be the first edit. This feels like the kind of story that's going to need multiple edits in order to get to where it needs to be. So I don't expect it to be perfect here. I do think the bones of the story are there, but there's a lot that's going to need to be filled out. I think right now I'm just going to go through the story without adding a lot and just kind of try to smooth over some of the edges. And then probably in the second edit, I'm going to need to write more story to fill out some details with some of the beats of action from this particular story. But we'll just see if we can make it a little bit better today. And then this will be the last thing for stream. All right, so this is Fall of King Noel Baba. Again, a Christmas horror story. All right, the elves were frostbitten and so very afraid because it wasn't every day they tried to murder a king. I've got a lot of dark stories going right now, don't I? But on that bitter cold night at the top of the world, the elven rebellion was on the verge of collapse, like every effort to hold the Red King to account before it. Too much rode on the shoulders of three elves trying to change history in a single night. Sprig, Tael, and Barton slogged through the snow in the dark patches between the stables and the toy shop. The flying beasts in their stalls just beyond the wall battered their horns against the sides of their enclosures. They seemed to sense something was amiss. Not all elves were in on it. Some of them liked the Round Master, but most were just afraid. Trying to slave an immortal was a fool's business. This was why mortals tended to fear their gods and call their terror love and respect. There were only so many... Let me fix something here. And frame... their terror as love and respect. I think that's a better sentence. All right, there were only so many of their kind that this freezing trio could count on once the violence was unleashed. Even then, this was an unlikely thing to succeed. Sprig shouted over the wind to the others, "You need to be ready. Once this starts, there will be no time for hesitation and no room for error." "Are you talking to us or yourself?" Tael shouted back. Sprig heard him, even if just barely, but with the driving snow and whistling winds, he thought maybe he could get away with pretending he didn't. Barton dropped to his hands and knees in the snow and started clearing the icy cover with his bare hands as his fingers went from olive to fish-belly white. "Help me find it and stop with all the idle chatter." Sprig's teeth chattered, but he stopped talking as he raked his fingers through the snow as well. Elves were used to the cold. That's why the king chose them as his slaves. But even they were not meant to be playing out here at night like children building a snowman in warmer climates. Tael began a fit of coughing and did his best to muffle it in the fur of his collar. He returned to searching with the others. Then Sprig hooked some hidden link of metal in the ice. He pulled hard enough to lift a few links of the chain into view. "I got it." His voice was low and well below the cries of the wind, but his partners saw what he found and joined him in lifting. Let me fix that. That's what editing is for, right? In lifting the chain. As the metal thing uncovered, it pulled taut against the hook of the buried box. Now the real work began. They started by cutting out the perimeter of the hidden box. Sprig could not imagine anything surviving in that crypt, but whether he truly had faith anymore, this was still their only hope. Sprig started to clear the snow piled on top, but Barton pushed his hands aside and shouted close to Sprig's pointy ear beneath the edge of his cap, "Forget the top. We just need to clear the door and get this thing opened." I feel like I need to specify something here. They have been waiting long enough. All right, that's good. Doesn't explain everything, but I think it closes the timeline a little. "Hurry," Tael ordered. Help me before the fat man discovers us. The service doors along the side of the toy shop behind them burst open as if the king had been summoned. Light spilled out across the snow cover and never truly finished melting in any season. It was piled against the base of the doors, but the mighty ruler... Need to fix that. The mighty ruler of this frozen kingdom forced them open hard enough to plow away 2 new snowbanks in one great motion. All right. He stood over them with his shadow cast across their treacherous business like the shade from a giant. He spread his arms between the open doors like a wizard, casting his deadly dark magic upon his enemies. The other elves, still warm inside, bent over their workbenches. I'm going to have to change this to ing. Cowering away from the blowing winds and the anger of their eternal master. He let loose with his bellowing laugh that rose deep from his broad belly. It could almost sound like a jolly noise to those who did not truly know what he was capable of. I almost swallowed wrong. And it was a strange noise, a ho instead of a ha. No one else laughed like that unless they were imitating the king himself. None of his elves ever dared to mock him the way so many humans did. As they awaited their sweatshop presents each year. All right, good stuff. Apparently the elves are exploited in this story. Did you bring me a present, my little elves? His voice was laced with all sorts of threat. Sprig wanted to finish clearing the door to the hidden box, even though it was pointless now. They had gotten so close. So much closer than their fathers before them. Now, let me put this further away. We'll say their great-grandfathers. Their great-great-grandfathers before them. There we go. The Red King saved them the trouble of deciding what to do next or how to answer as he charged forward, kicking up slush with his heavy black boots. He showed his perfect white teeth as he unfurled his braided whip. He managed to lash the disobedient elves twice from 2 directions before they realized he had ever struck. The elves still inside the shop cried out louder than the trio, who dripped bright blood into the disturbed snow under their shoes. The bright blood, let's say, from their new wounds. From their new striped wounds into the disturbed snow under their shoes. The others certainly did not want to watch more of their kind die like this, but that was exactly why the master left the doors open. He wanted them to see the price of this sort of foolishness one more time. They tried to scatter, climbing up out of the hole they had made in the cover, where the metal box sat askew with its chain coiled like a frozen silver snake. They were not quick enough, though. The master stomped on Barton's back, pressing him down into the white until he disappeared under that black boot. The whip wrapped around Tyle's throat and jerked him backward off his feet in the air. He landed hard on top of the box with a hollow thump, clearing the snow off of it anyway. Something inside the crate stirred hard enough to shake the box from side to side. That distracted the king, and Sprig hooked around the man's back, through the master's tracks toward the open toy shop. The other elves still inside did not seem to know what Sprig had planned, but they scattered out of his path, spilling unfinished toys and their tools off the tables and onto the floor in the flickering firelight. The master turned on him and covered the ground back to the shop faster than Sprig's smaller legs could carry him. They passed the threshold together, but the king slapped the fleeing elf off his feet and to his face on the hard work floor. Falling in the snow might have hurt less. Melting snow off the boots of the angry king where the master usually insisted that everyone wipe their feet before entering the shop. He seemed not to notice as he scooped the elf up from the floor and proceeded to squeeze the little guy between his mitten-covered hands. Let's say mitten-clad. Mitten-clad hands. No, let's say fists. Fists imply more violence than hands do. Sprig twisted in the master's grasp and showed his teeth under a curled lip. The look of pain on the bad elf's face brought another belly laugh from the king. Sprig whipped around and sliced one rosy cheek with a carving tool he had managed to snag from the floor. As blood spilled ruby red from the king's leering lips, Sprig cut him again through the tender flesh under the man's nose. The king let out a girlish scream so unlike himself. He dropped Sprig, and the elf managed to land on his feet. This moment might have changed everything that followed. The king clapped his hands to his bleeding face and moaned again. As he finally dropped his hands with a growl, he flung droplets of blood off his fingers to purl upon the floor in the melting puddles around his boots. What he saw were other elves rising from where they had cowered under their workbenches. They too took up tools and brandished them as weapons as they gathered around Sprig. The master faltered just a bit and sniffed up blood in his ruined nose. He reached for his belt where he normally kept his whip, but it wasn't there. The master turned just in time to catch a painful braid across his belly as Tael used the whip against the king. He surprised the elves by retreating out into the storm. Let's say the master. No. The man. The man surprised the elves by retreating out into the storm. They let out a rare war cry that their kind had not used in too many generations to remember. They charged after him, intent upon taking him apart and ignoring the cold. The king leapt over the exposed box in the snow and threw himself against the stable doors. "We have him," Sprig cried. "End him and free us all." Free us all at last, let's say. All right. The king threw open the doors, and the flying beasts took to the air. Snow melted in their thick fur as they circled overhead where they were still warm from the stables. The beasts finally dove and ended several elves bloody upon their antlers. The king laughed as the surviving elves scattered. He stopped laughing when he caught his own whip across his damaged face. On the backswing, the king seized the braid and pulled it from Tael's grasp. Sprig came for him with the bloody carving tool in hand, but had to veer away as the beast trampled through and over the elves, still trying to fight. Barton and several others dove into the hole around the crate for cover. The king bellowed his own war cry and snapped his whip, hitting elves and his flying beasts alike. Then the tide turned again, one beast crying out, and then another. Then one fell to the snow with its belly open and steam rising from its guts in the snow. In the white. All right, I apologize if any of you are sensitive to gore. That's one of the few places I got detailed with it, I guess. More elves fell, but the flying beasts lost much of their momentum as their fellows were surrounded. Well, I am off on verb tenses, and brought down to die screaming where they landed. Wherever they landed, that's a good, okay. The king's fury faltered again, and he took to run. A few elves pursued, but Sprig held back, not trusting the ancient master. The ancient master and his bag of tricks. Let him flee into the snow as the elves secured the fortress for himself. Sprig decided. But then through the snow he saw the cave the king approached. Surely even the terrible king was not that mad, but Sprig already knew the truth. Cover, Sprig cried. Take cover, he's unleashing the great wretch. As the king pulled open the thunderous doors over the cave entrance, both the elves and the surviving beasts looked for anywhere to hide. Come forth, the king's voice echoed. The footsteps thundered, and then the white, furry giant let out a monstrous roar as it plunged out into the storm. Let's say free for the first time in eons. Sprig ran for the toy shop, knowing he wouldn't make it. The great wretch snatched beasts from the sky and swallowed them whole. He took apart every elf in his path, and the king laughed at all the destruction. Help us, Barton cried. Sprig turned his head, expecting to see his old friend dying in agony, but it wasn't a cry of pain. Barton needed help with the original plan. Sprig detoured and dove into the hole, with the elves still trying to clear the crate. Barton and Sprig unlatched the door and tried to pull it open. Keep clearing the snow, Sprig ordered. Tyle dove in with them and helped them pull at the crate's hatch. The great wretch must have spied the shiny metal in the snow, for it started charging toward them on all fours. The giant monster closed the distance quickly. Let's say, as it shook the frozen world. Let's say, casting great piles of snow into the air to fall again. Alright, good stuff. Alright, we're on the last page. Unless I keep adding a lot more, I suppose. Pull, Sprig yelled, as if the other elves weren't already straining with all their might. Then something inside the crate started pushing too, and the hatch burst open. The elves scattered as the terrors poured forth, all matter of misfits and abominations that the king had banished to an island that the king had long ago. Banished to an island now rose up at the place of their birth. Sprig spared one thought to the idea that this plan was mad. I'll say was as mad as the Red King. But they were as desperate as him in this final hour. Alright, I like that. The great wretch never hesitated, but it started to flail about as the rejected toys struck him in the air from all sides. They burnt into his fur and flesh with acids. They cut with their sharp edges that no toys were meant to have, and many of them started to eat the monster that had consumed so many others in his time. The wretch continued to fight, but then the flying beasts and the elves joined in, and the great wretch fell for the last time. As the misfits took him apart from the inside out, that's pretty gross, the master of the monster looked for somewhere to flee. Apparently, his bag was finally empty, and their captor, after all these years, was out of tricks. One more creature climbed out of the crate. This banished elf was twisted and disfigured from all his years of exile. Twitchy the elf's great hatred had grown with time. Instead of waiting for help, Twitchy sprung from the crate and chased down the screaming king himself. He took many wounds. In that fight, but would not let up on his former master. This had become a rebellion of one. The elves had unleashed a monster of their own. Finally, Twitchy and the king both fell to the snow, heaving for breath. Sprig. They were both spent. Sprig did not trust the twisted elf, but he ordered his brother in from the workshop to tend to Twitchy's wounds. Let's say anyway. He had cast his lot, after all. What it meant to have the dark elf back in their midst would be a problem to deal with later. As the wretch gave one final cry of pain, they attached ropes to each of the king's limbs and looped them over the beasts, who now served the elves. Upon Sprig's order, they pulled their old master in 4 different directions. His cries of pain had just begun as he came apart and painted the snow. There would be no toys made by enslaved elves delivered that year or any year to come. The king had fallen, and the elves would rule themselves once more. All right, I like that. For my own purposes, I'm going to make a dotted line here because I need to add more to this final scene, I think. But I'm satisfied with it for now.